Why does Hollow Knight look like it does? For this video, I'm gonna try and answer that question from a game art perspective and explain what purpose each design choice serve, and then apply those principles to show how it would look. I'm gonna rapidly go through different elements in the game, pointing out certain problems they're helping to solve. Let's start with the knight, and why he's black and white. I like to think of it sort of as an anti-Where's Waldo. No matter where you look, you always see him. This is important because it makes it so you don't need to focus any attention on finding the character when you play. He's always just there. And you might think that this is pedantic overanalysis. After all, the character is in the middle of the screen, so you can obviously see him all the time. But a lot of these small choices do make a difference for how easy it is to read the game. And we can see that with this next thing, which serves the same purpose, and is also blatantly more obvious. The character has a spotlight on him. This makes it so that all the background elements close to the knight are slightly whiter. And since the knight himself is largely black, it means you get a high contrast between him and the background elements, making it just a tiny bit easier separating the player from the background. Next, let's look at the shape of the knight and why he's shaped like penicillin. It's probably because the underlying hitbox is a capsule collider or something similar. Matching the collider and the sprite ensures that you don't encounter very obvious clipping. You see, some of the constraints that you're working with when designing a game is that the art kinda has to match the underlying mechanics of the game and constraints that they are working with. So the knight is sort of just a fancy thing you get to look at, while in actuality you're just a capsule jumping around. I personally think that the eyes look like they do for the same reason. I mean, they look really cool, hollow pits, but they also really make sense from a game art perspective. Because if they are hollow pits, you don't have to worry about making the character blink or looking at bosses or whatever. From a programming perspective, the character is in some ways invariant to the environment. That is, the character can't react to changes in the environment. So it's often easier to design for that invariance in mind. So if you don't have eyes, you don't need to worry about blinking or the character having to look at different things. It's just sort of static and isolated from whatever is happening in the environment. This is probably also why the jump kind of looks like this, because you can carry that motion infinitely without it looking weird. I mean, in reality, most people jump in more of an arc, perfectly matching when they are expecting to land. But the game doesn't know when you're expected to land, which is why we often get jumping motions in games like balls, this, or this. So why this pose? Well, honestly, it could have been many poses, but this one is a really good keyframe with a strong silhouette. A good silhouette is a good thing to shoot for. I mean, a good silhouette can even become iconic, like the Mario jump. There are plenty of cool animation aspects of the design, such as turning frames and similar. I'm just gonna mention one, and that's the hitting animation, which has a strong white slash and what you call sort of a smear. Doing it this way, I mean, it looks cool, but it also makes it so the hit can feel both responsive and impactful. Okay, let us now look at the environment. It looks great. It's expansive, rich, and in many ways unique and real. So how did one person manage to do this for a game this big? First trick is to minimize the amount of things you have to draw. So create a lot of assets that are naturally repeatable. Rocks, bushes, trees, cobblestone. But it isn't just about the type of assets, but also the shape of the asset. This asset is quite easy to repeat, this one isn't. In this case, it becomes really clear that it's the same asset being repeated. Honestly, this is mostly about not having too distinct a shape. Luckily, you'll probably notice if it looks bad. Once you have these repeatable assets, you can create quite large scenes while still drawing relatively little. But I can easily make it look kinda empty. So it's often quite good to make one or two unique assets. And Hollow Knight does this quite often. It makes it so that when you are in an area, your attention goes to the unique asset, making the entire area look quite unique, even though the rest of the assets are carbon copies of each other. So by using this method, you have minimized the amount of assets you have to draw. Now you just need to draw them quickly, which at least is one of the reasons for the simple shapes and distinct line art. Good, distinct silhouettes with easily readable yet visually distinct designs look good. Extra fluff can be nice, but it also means more work. One reason the game looks this way is because Eric Gibson is a great artist, but it's also because he had a lot of assets to make. Okay, how did they manage to make the game look so rich and real? First thing is 2.5D parallax. I covered it a bit in an old video of mine, but basically parallax is a term used to describe how things in the foreground move faster than things in the background, and gives a sort of 3D effect. But there are different ways to implement parallax, and Hollow Knight set up 2D assets in a 3D space, hence 2.5D. It is sort of like a diorama and means two things. Partly you get added depth, but it also means that you need to spend a lot of time crafting your areas, sort of like stage design. This is in my opinion why each area looks so rich and unique, because each area was meticulously crafted to look rich. It's easy to think that making good assets will result in a good looking game, but good looking assets won't look good if they aren't staged well. So how do we stage it? Well, with parallax you work in layers. We can see that the assets in the foreground get progressively darker until they're pitch black. This minimizes the amount of assets you have to draw or stage and makes the game more readable, which is what we're going to cover a little bit next. My first video, So Many Hollow Knight Clones, went a whole deal into the readability of Hollow Knight. Basically, a lot of the choices game artists have to make relate to solving problems, and one of the main problems that need to be solved is ensuring that the player can quickly see where the enemies, platforms, and the character is. We call this readability. Both the contrast of the character and the spotlight helps with readability. So does the black foreground. Further than that, atmospheric perspective helps with readability as well. What is atmospheric perspective? It's a fancy art term for describing how things further away are shifted to a muted color and also loses detail, like how mountains shift blue in the distance. And if we look at Hollow Knight, they have kind of implemented this as well. Blurred, low contrast backgrounds. The blur in this case is much more closer to bokeh with the camera, and that is because it's used to make it clear where the background begins and where the platforms end. Speaking of camera, it is actually worth looking into how zoomed out the camera in this case is, because it can tell you a bit about the game you're playing. If you're playing a purely platform-oriented game like Celeste, it will be really zoomed out so that you can see all the platforms that you need to jump to and plan ahead. In contrast, fighting games tend to be quite zoomed in. The camera in Hollow Knight is moderately zoomed in because it's an action platformer with some platforming elements, but also a lot of fighting. So now we have actually covered most things. Add some particle effects, dust ups when walking, wind, interactable objects, and you ensure that your environment feels alive. Oh, and not to forget, each area has a distinct color scheme so that it's easily identifiable, but also helps evoke a particular feeling, be it cold and desolate, overgrown, or horrifying. Lastly, I'm fairly sure there's a small grain filter, which makes everything look slightly less pristine and cartoony. So if we put all of these things together, we create a simple black and white character with black eyes. We add some clouds when he moves and a spotlight behind the character. We make simple assets and we don't need to make that many. In this case we're settling for 12. And then we spend time on stage design. We make the foreground assets progressively darker. We add blur on the background assets and a colored filter on each layer to reduce the contrast of the background assets. We create one unique asset which demands attention. Let's add the banana. And now when people look at this scene, they won't think about the 12 repeated assets. They'll think about the banana. My first attempt at making this scene looks like this. I spent less than an hour on the environment assets, but roughly 3 hours on designing the scene. I went back and worked some more on the assets. I kind of liked the first version, and if you do too, just know that it didn't require much drawing skills to draw these particular assets. Then we add particle effects, give the area some more life, and add a grain filter. Obviously at this point, adding interactable objects and a nice jumping animation goes along with it, but I think this roughly gives you an idea of how you can recreate some aspects of Hollow Knight yourself. And I haven't really covered much about animation or anything regarding the brushstrokes. Those are important aspects of the art style, and important if you want to make Hollow Knight fan art. If there's demand for a video covering those aspects, I might do one in the future. But I think that there are plenty of other games that would be cool to analyze. Thanks for watching. Bye.